during what theologians call his state of humiliation, that is to say, from his birth until his death, Christ did experience the limitations of normal human existence. And therefore, we should not imagine the baby Jesus lying in the manger, knowing everything that would happen to him in his life, contemplating the equations of quantum mechanics and Newtonian physics and things of that sort. That would be a monstrosity. The doctrine of the incarnation is not that Jesus of Nazareth was like Superman disguised as Clark Kent. Rather, this was a genuine emptying of himself in taking on this state of humiliation. And I've attempted to provide a model that makes sense of this by differentiating in a theologically significant way between Jesus' conscious life and his subconscious life.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is both an honor and a privilege to introduce you today a philosopher whose work has a profound influence on contemporary debates in philosophy of religion, ethics, and metaphysics, Dr. William Lane Craig. Renowned for his compelling defense of the cosmological argument, his exploration of the nature of time, and his extensive contributions to discussions of objective morality, Dr. Craig has become a leading voice in the intersection of philosophy and theology. On behalf of the Philippa Foot Society, on behalf of the Philippa Foot Society event, can we please give a warm and enthusiastic welcome?
Thank you.
How do you go about justifying the evidential problem of evil?
I argue that the evidential problem of evil requires of the atheist probability judgments that are simply beyond our capacity to make with any sort of confidence. He has to say that it is highly improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evils and suffering that we observe in a world. But it seems to me that we're simply not in a position to make that kind of judgment, especially when you think that a God who providentially oversees the entire world, past, present, and future, could have reasons for permitting evils to occur that within our limited frame of reference would look utterly pointless and unnecessary. But his sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until, say, hundreds of years later, perhaps even in another country, so that we have simply no idea whatsoever that it's improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing these evils to occur. Secondly, I would also say that we have very good positive arguments for the existence of God that simply outweigh any improbability that the evidential problem of evil would throw upon God. Even if relative to the evil and suffering in the world, God's existence is improbable, I think that we have countervailing arguments for the existence of God that in the end at least balance the scales, if not make it more probable that God exists. And then finally, I would say, thirdly, that the evidential problem of evil seems to assume that God's purposes for humanity are happiness and fulfillment in this life. But according to a Christian view of God, that's false. We are not God's pets, and God's purpose is not to make us happy in this life, but rather to bring people into an eternal love relationship with him that will last beyond the grave forever. And it is not at all improbable that only in a world suffused with moral and natural evils, that the optimal number of persons would freely come to know God and find eternal life and embrace his salvation. And so I think that the evidential problem of evil is actually easier to solve given Christian theism than just some bare-boned theism. So those would be three responses that I would unfold and have defended in my book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview.
You've written about the importance of historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. How would you address the criticism that relying on historical evidence to support religious claims is problematic?
This is interesting because the principal facts undergirding the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are not miraculous. The principal facts, as I adduce them, are, first of all, that after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Secondly, that on the first day of the week, that tomb was discovered to be empty by a group of Jesus' female disciples. And thirdly, that the earliest disciples suddenly and abruptly came to experience post-mortem visions of Jesus. And finally, the original disciples underwent a transformation of their lives that had no predisposition in their antecedent Jewish beliefs. What they came to believe about Jesus was very, very un-Jewish and requires some sort of an explanation. Now, you notice that none of those facts is miraculous. Anyone could investigate the evidence for those facts using the ordinary canons of historical research. So my claim is that any historian can come to accept those conclusions on the basis of historical evidence. Now, what he might not be able to do is infer that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of those facts. If you impose upon the historian a methodological constraint that historians are allowed to infer only natural explanations for events, then the inference to Jesus' resurrection would be methodologically barred to him. He could establish the facts of the honorable burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the transformation of the disciples, but he couldn't infer that the best explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead, as they claimed he had. Now, one could question that methodological constraint. Why is the historian methodologically constrained in that way? But leave that aside. Even if the historian, qua historian, has to operate under this methodological constraint, the rest of us are not so obligated. As a philosopher, I'm not obligated to obey the methodological constraints of the professional historian. If I think that the evidence is best explained by a miraculous explanation, I'm perfectly free to draw that inference. And I would say that that's true for even the historian in his off hours, so to speak, when he's not acting qua professional historian, but just as a human being. He might well draw the inference that the best explanation of those facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. So I'm not all that terribly worried about a mere methodological constraint that would prevent the historian from drawing a miraculous conclusion.
Do you have the faith that you have because you believe in this resurrection, or is it the faith that you have that leads you to believe in this resurrection?
Wow, I'm not sure it's that simple, that it's either or. When I first heard the message of the gospel as a 16-year-old, I began to read the Gospels, and I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a ring of truth about his teachings and a wisdom about this man that I had never encountered before. Moreover, there was an authenticity about his life that was so undeniable and captivating. So as I read these New Testament accounts of his crucifixion and burial and empty tomb, I just found myself believing them. They just seemed to me to be credible reports of what actually happened. And so that was how I came to then become a Christian. I read the Gospels. These reports struck me as true. And so I believed what they said. And eventually, after some time, I made a commitment of my life to Christ. For me, the important decision was making that heart commitment rather than the intellectual decision. The intellectual decision came fairly quickly, but it took me around 6 months or so to really make that commitment of the heart and move that personal trust from my head to my heart. So that's the best I could do to answer your question.
How would you respond to Anthony Fou's claim of if religious language cannot be falsified, then it is not meaningful? Yes.
Well, I would say that that is an arbitrary criterion of meaning that there is no reason to accept. And that moreover, there are plenty of counterexamples to that. For example, take the proposition that the universe began to exist. That proposition is verifiable by the evidence, but it's not falsifiable because it's possible that God created a steady state universe out of nothing a finite time ago. And that would have all the appearances of being eternal in the past. And therefore, you couldn't falsify the statement that the universe began to exist, but you could verify it. And so that's clearly a meaningful statement. It seems to me that verification and falsification are just irrelevant to whether or not the propositions are meaningful. Meaning is just a matter of good grammar. If they are grammatically well formulated, then it's a meaningful claim. Falsification and verification has to do with one's evidential basis or grounds for believing it. You might not have good evidential grounds for believing a non-falsifiable proposition, but in that case, it would still be meaningful. You just maybe would have weak evidential grounds for it.
You said before that for you, the challenge with Christianity was not accepting the facts of it, but actually making the change to living as a Christian. Would you say then that it's possible to accept the facts presented in the Bible, but not agree with the ethics and ethical teachings given in the Bible? And how would you live your life like that?
Oh, certainly. I think you could believe that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who lived and taught these things, but that he was terribly mistaken in his ethical views. I think Bertrand Russell believed something like that. Russell didn't deny that Jesus gave these teachings, but Russell nevertheless found them morally abhorrent. For example, Jesus' teachings about hell, Russell disagreed with. So certainly a person could believe these narratives historically, even though you disagree with the ethical content of Jesus' teachings. I would say what you could not do, and maybe this is what the questioner was really getting at, you could not believe in the deity of Christ. You couldn't believe that Jesus was God incarnate if you thought he gave false ethical teachings, because giving false ethical teachings would be incompatible with God's moral perfection and omniscience.
In a discussion with Francis Collins, Dawkins said that he finds the argument for fine-tuning to be the most convincing argument for a creator. In that spirit, what would you find the most convincing argument for there being no God or no creator?
Yes. Well, I think that the best atheistic argument is the argument from the hiddenness of God. I think that contemporary discussions of the problem of evil and suffering have tended to morph into this somewhat different problem, namely that God's existence seems so hidden. He could have made his existence so much more evident to us, but God's existence is difficult to discern and obscure, and therefore unbelief seems quite possible. And so I do think that the argument based on divine hiddenness has some force. If God exists, why hasn't he made his existence more evident to us? And my response, for what it's worth to that, is, first of all, I think that God has made his existence pretty evident to us. I've defended around 6 arguments for the existence of God that I think make a powerful cumulative case that God exists. Most proponents of the hiddenness of God objection think that there are no good arguments for the existence of God on the other side of the scale. So, absent any good arguments for God's existence, the hiddenness of God is very powerful for them. But you see, I think there is something on the other side of the scale. And then secondly, I would make a similar point that I made to the evidential problem of evil, namely, given a God who possesses what is called middle knowledge, God knows what kind of and what amount of evidence would be most effective in bringing the optimal number of people freely to find salvation and eternal life. And if he knew that making his existence more evident would be more effective in doing that, then he would have given us more evidence. But knowing how much and what kinds of evidence to provide to achieve the optimal balance of salvation in the world, I think that God is under no obligation to provide no more evidence when he knew that it wouldn't do any good. And here, keep in mind that God's purpose is not simply getting people to add another item to their ontological inventory of what exists. In one sense, that's a matter of indifference to God. What's important to him is building a personal relationship with him, bringing people into a relationship of love and salvation with him. And it may well be the case that by making his existence hidden and requiring people to seek out God and search for him and pray, that God actually augments the number of people who come to such a saving knowledge of himself, in contrast to a world in which, say, God's existence is as plain as the nose on your face, so that everybody believes that he's there, but perhaps not as many come to know him personally and find salvation.
How does a metaphysical being interact with a physical world?
First of all, I would argue that there aren't any good arguments against psychophysical interaction. And here one would explore arguments in the philosophy of mind as to why dualism interactionism cannot be true between the soul and the body. And I don't think there are any good arguments against that kind of psychophysical interaction. Indeed, I would say quite the contrary, that we have compelling evidence in our own personal experience that the immaterial soul does act upon its physical body. I can will to do things like raise my arm simply by willing. So I don't see, it seems to me that we have very good evidence for the possibility of this kind of psychophysical interaction in our own ability as minds to control and affect our bodies. One other point that I would make, and I lay this out in my forthcoming systematic philosophical theology, is that I believe Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism is more correctly understood as an evolutionary argument against the causal closure of the physical. And what Plantinga shows is that it is irrational to believe in an evolutionary account of our cognitive faculties and at the same time to believe in the causal closure of the physical. That is to say that physical events have only physical causes. What Plantinga's argument shows is that that position is literally self-defeating and therefore cannot be rationally affirmed. So I think this is an almost knockdown argument against those who propound the causal closure of the physical. That is to say that there cannot be psychophysical causation.
Bertrand Russell famously rejected the first cause argument by asking if everything has a cause, who caused God? How do you respond to this critique within the framework of the Kalam cosmological argument?
Russell's criticisms were primarily of what I call the Leibnizian argument from contingency, which is different than the version of the argument that I like best, which is an argument against an infinite regress of past events. And what Russell does is he basically denies the principle of sufficient reason that Leibniz enunciated, that every truth has a reason why it is so and not otherwise. And I do think there are powerful objections that can be lodged against Leibniz's statement of the principle of sufficient reason. And for that reason, I was myself, for many years, skeptical of the argument from contingency. But then the philosopher Stephen Davis helped me to understand that there are more modest versions of the principle of sufficient reason that are much more plausible and that are sufficient for an argument from contingency for the existence of God. And so the version that Davis suggested and that I've adopted goes like this. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And I think that modest statement of the principle of sufficient reason is very plausible and therefore unobjectionable, and that can serve as the first premise in a contingency argument that which would state that if the universe then has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external transcendent being, and the universe is something that exists, and therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is this external transcendent being or God. So take a look at my defense of that argument, for example, in my book, Reasonable Faith. I think that it presents a more modest and very plausible version of the argument from contingency that escapes Russell's criticisms.
Paul Tillich says that God doesn't exist, but he's the ground of all being. Do you think that that's somehow compatible with the belief in a Christian God, or is it not at all compatible?
Now, if I understand the question, you're asking it, if you deny that God is the ground of all being, then is that compatible with Christian theology?
Paul Tillich says that God doesn't exist, but he's the ground of all being. And we have this understanding that God is a being and is somehow physical and is somehow in one place, when actually that's kind of maybe a simplified understanding. But can you take the understanding that he's the ground of all being and still kind of be a Christian and believe in the Christian?
Well, I think that certainly Christians do believe that God is the ground of all being. if you read Thomas Aquinas, his third way of proving the existence of God is to show that God is the ground of all being. He is a metaphysically necessary source of all else that exists. But I think Tillich's faux pas lay in thinking that the ground of all being cannot itself be a being. It seems to me that if we differentiate between metaphysically necessary beings and contingent beings, then there's no problem with saying, as I just indicated a moment ago, that the explanation of God's existence lies in the necessity of his own nature, and that he then is the external cause of every other thing that exists, all contingent being. So if we draw the distinction between necessary existence and contingent existence, I don't see any problem at all in saying that God is a metaphysically necessary being.
Do you believe that by attributing characteristics to God, we are simultaneously limiting him?
Oh,
Religious language.
Yeah, no, I don't see any reason to limit ourselves to a sort of via negativa with respect to God. Certainly, we can make negative predications about God. For example, God is timeless, God is spaceless, God is immaterial. But it seems to me that we also can make positive predications about God, such as God is morally perfect, God is omnipotent, God is eternal. And I would say that we can speak univocally of God when we make these predications. I see no reason at all to think that our predications, our positive predications of God, are either equivocal or even analogical. It seems to me that there is a univocal core of meaning that we can give to these positive predicates when applied to God. In fact, when I treat the attributes of God, such as omnipotence, omniscience, eternity, I don't define those in terms of God. I define those properties neutrally, so that, for example, for any individual S is omnipotent if and only if, and then you state the conditions. Or for any individual S is omniscient if and only if, and then you state the conditions. So these conditions hold not just for God, they would hold for any being that is treated as omniscient or omnipotent or whatever. So I don't think that we are in any way confined to negative statements about God and cannot make positive predications in a univocal sense.
Why does God reveal himself through miracles in the Gospels?
Well, when you look at the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels, they are treated as signs of the inbreaking of God's kingdom in the person of Jesus in human history. The same is true of the exorcisms that Jesus performed. It's historically certain that the person Jesus of Nazareth was a faith healer and an exorcist. And the centerpiece of his proclamation was that in his person, the kingdom of God, long awaited, was breaking into human history. And the exorcisms and the miraculous healings were signs to people of the inbreaking of God's kingdom. So they authenticated the message of Jesus by providing external verification for them.
Do you think we're truly free because of things like societal norms which are built into our behaviors?
Oh, yes. When I affirm human freedom, I'm talking about a limited freedom. Certainly, as people raised in a particular culture and society, we imbibe deeply the values of our culture and what our parents have taught us as we were raised. And so that's very clear that there is a kind of soft determinism that arises because of our upbringing. But that falls short of saying that therefore we're just automata who have no ability to reflect upon these matters and sometimes break free of those constraints, or to freely affirm them if we think that they are legitimate. So I would affirm freedom within limits.
There are a few times in the Bible where sometimes it seems like Jesus didn't fully know what might happen. For example, when he's he thought that the kingdom of God was coming and it was coming.
Yes.
Or another example is when he's on the cross in Mark and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It seems like he's asking questions, and it seems like there's some kind of limit to his omnipotence, which to me questions the idea that he is fully God and fully human. If there is an element kind of not knowing everything, because you'd think that that being would know everything if he was fully God, as Trinitarian theology says.
Yes. Now, I don't think that the two examples you gave are very good examples of Jesus' limited knowledge. I'll say something about that in a minute, but nevertheless, I want to agree with your overall point, nonetheless, that during what theologians call his state of humiliation, that is to say, from his birth until his death, that Christ did experience the limitations of normal human existence. And therefore, we should not imagine the baby Jesus lying in the manger, knowing everything that would happen to him in his life, contemplating the equations of quantum mechanics and Newtonian physics and things of that sort. That would be a monstrosity. The doctrine of the incarnation is not that Jesus of Nazareth was like Superman disguised as Clark Kent. Rather, this was a genuine emptying of himself in taking on this state of humiliation. And I've attempted to provide a model that makes sense of this by differentiating in a theologically significant way between Jesus' conscious life and his subconscious life. As human persons, we are much, much more than our mere waking consciousness. There are deep springs of our behavior that lie in our subconscious, of which we're only dimly aware, if at all. And we experience this sometimes during memory lapses. We say, oh, I remember that person's name. It's right on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember it. And then later, suddenly it comes to us. It was in our subconscious all the time, but we just weren't aware of it at that moment. And so I think we can say that much of Jesus' divine knowledge lay in the divine subliminal or subconscious, and that only that knowledge was conscious in Jesus, which was consistent with an authentic human experience. And that would include growing over time. You have the baby Jesus with a typical infant consciousness, and then the adolescent Jesus, and then finally the adult Jesus with a growth in knowledge. So I think not only is it consistent with, but Christian theology wants to affirm that Jesus was limited in knowledge in the way that you describe, even though in his divine nature, I would say in the divine subconscious, he knew all those things, though he wasn't consciously aware of them. Now, with respect to the examples you gave, I think that there are good indications in the Gospels that Jesus did not know when his return would occur. There are a couple of passages that, taken in isolation, make it sound like he thought that he would return within the lifetime of his generation. But those passages, I think, need to be balanced with other passages where he says, no one knows the time of my return, no angel in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father. And there's some of his parables that suggest a very long time before his return. If you're interested in seeing a discussion of this in more depth, you could look at my lectures on Christology or Doctrine of Christ in my Defenders series that is on our website, reasonablefaith.org. So just go to the Defenders transcripts and look at the Doctrine of Christ, and you'll see this question addressed there. As for the so-called cry of dereliction from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? What is so fascinating about this is that Jesus is quoting Psalm 22. Look up Psalm 22 in your Old Testament. This is a psalm of God's servant in distress, crying out to God. And Jesus is praying the words of Psalm 22. So far from manifesting his lack of faith in God or his limitations, this indicates that at this moment, Jesus was expressing the depth of his commitment to God, the faithful servant of God in distress, praying in the words of Psalm 22. So I think that that cry actually goes to show quite the opposite of what one might think at first, if one's not aware of its Old Testament background.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about divine command theory and the Euthyphro dilemma, which for everyone else here is about the divine command theory, where they say, are actions good because God commanded them, or are they commanded by God because they are good? If actions are morally correct because of their nature, it is argued that God cannot have created them, which means that God is not powerful. And if actions are morally correct because God created them, then could God have made murder and theft, which arguably are morally bad things to do? So I wonder what you thought of that and divine command theory.
Now, if I understand your question correctly, the divine command theorist is not committed to what's called voluntarism, that God could have just made up anything to be right or anything to be wrong and could have willed that hatred be good and love be evil. Rather, the divine command theory, such as articulated by people like Robert Adams, Philip Quinn, William Alston, is that God, by his very nature, is good and has a holy, loving, and just nature, so that it is metaphysically impossible that he could issue commands which go contrary to his own nature. He must command things that are at least consistent with his nature. So he could have commanded us to do different things, but it had to be consistent with the nature of a perfectly loving and perfectly just being. And so I think that the divine command theory, as is most plausibly articulated, is not a voluntaristic theory, but it roots moral values in God's nature, and it roots moral obligations or duties in his commands. So our duties are rooted in his commands, and moral values are rooted in his nature, and his commands must be consistent with his nature.
Should a believer be skeptical of realist miracles due to their supernatural nature, or should they strengthen their belief?
I do think that with regard to miracle claims, it is good to have a healthy skepticism, because miracle claims are so often false. So I am not a great enthusiast of contemporary claims to miracles, faith healings, and things of that sort. I think that we need to ask ourselves whether or not there is good evidence for believing in these miracles. And with respect to the miracles of Jesus, I would say that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, which I think is pretty solid, gives us grounds for believing that he was who he claimed to be, namely the divine Son of God, the long-awaited Messiah, the Son of Man, who heralded the advent of the kingdom of God. And that when viewed in that context, his miracles do become credible, because they would be consistent with exactly who he claimed to be and who we have good reason to believe he was.
Thank you.
Bill, just on that note, the students here have to study David Hume's criticisms of miracles. How would you go about counter-arguing David Hume's essay of miracles?
Yes. I would recommend that the students take a look at John Ehrman's book, Hume's Abject Failure. John Ehrman is an eminent philosopher of science at the University of Pittsburgh and not a theist at all. And yet, when he looks at Hume's argument against miracles, Ehrman says this is an abject failure. And the force of that word abject is that this is an irremediable failure. The argument is demonstrably fallacious, and cannot be rectified or corrected. And the reason it's an irremediable failure is that the probability calculus had not yet been developed by the mid-18th century when Hume published his Essay of Miracles. And so Hume neglects certain factors in the probability calculus that make his argument mathematically fallacious. In particular, he neglects what are called the likelihood ratios. That is to say, what is the probability of the evidence, given the miracle and our background information, compared to the probability of the miracle, or the probability of the evidence, given no miracle and our background information? So what is the probability of the evidence, given the miracle and the background information, compared to the probability of the evidence, given the falsehood of the miracle and our background information? And Hume doesn't even consider that ratio because the probability calculus had not been developed when he wrote. And when you do factor that in, that ratio can easily outbalance any intrinsic probability in the miracle considered on the background information or on the evidence alone. So Hume's argument is mathematically fallacious because it leaves out this crucial factor in the probability calculus.
Thank you so much for all your help and really, really insightful answering of our questions. I know we jumped around quite a few topics, but actually I think we've all felt like some of our burning questions have been kind of maybe deepened, or we've got slightly different perspectives now than we did before. So it's incredibly helpful for us for our A-levels, but just generally for our own entertainment and fascination in the subject. So thank you so much. Can everybody join me for one more round of applause?
Well, you're certainly welcome. I love chatting with you students at Canford. It was a pleasure visiting the campus. And then since then, these Zoom meetings have really been fun for me as well. So I'm glad if it was helpful. Thank you.
you.